Hungry? Thank your lucky stars you weren't alive in the Middle Ages. When famine struck medieval Europe, which happened with terrifying regularity, people ate things that would make modern stomachs turn. Get ready to discover the weird foods that kept people alive when they had nothing else to eat. People didn't have the luxury of being picky eaters. Grass became a staple food, not just for livestock, but for humans too. People would grind it up, mix it with a tiny bit of flour if they were lucky, and bake it into what we might generously call bread. One medieval account describes grass bread as green inside and tasting of grass. Yum. 5-star review for sure. Tree bark, particularly from elm, birch, and pine trees, got scraped off, dried, ground into powder, and mixed with anything they could find to make it slightly more palatable. In Finland and other northern regions, people actually developed techniques for preparing pine bark bread that didn't taste completely horrible. The trick was removing the bitter outer layer and only using the inner cambium layer. Medieval life hack: when eating trees, be selective about which part you chew. Nettles might sting your hands while picking them, but they became surprisingly popular during hard times. Rich in iron and actually quite nutritious, nettle soup was a springtime lifesaver when winter stores ran out. Once boiled, the stinging chemicals break down, making them safe to eat. One medieval English cookbook even includes a recipe for nettle pudding, proving that humans will try to make anything fancy if given enough time. Dandelions, chickweed, sorrel, and even moss found their way into the medieval pot. Every part was used: roots, stems, leaves, and flowers. Nothing went to waste when starvation loomed. Some monasteries maintained records of which weeds were edible, creating early survival guides. Next time you complain about eating your vegetables, remember your medieval ancestors who dreamed of having actual vegetables instead of the moss and tree bark smoothie they were enjoying. Speaking of creative medieval cuisine, if you thought eating plants was desperate, wait until you hear about the crawling creatures that made their way onto dinner plates. Frogs, snails, and slugs became regular menu items during tough medieval times. No need for fancy introductions here. When you're hungry enough, anything that moves slower than you do becomes dinner. Frogs were skewered on sticks and roasted over fires, their legs providing tiny morsels of meat that actually taste similar to chicken. The original frog leg diet wasn't about losing weight. It was about not dying. Medieval cooking shows would have had very different catchphrases. Catch it, cook it, try not to look at it while eating it. Snails were surprisingly popular across Europe, especially during fasting periods. The Catholic Church had strict rules about not eating meat on Fridays and during Lent, the 40 days before Easter. But due to a bizarre loophole, snails weren't considered meat. This technicality made snails the perfect fasting food. Medieval cookbooks reveal that snails were often boiled in vinegar and herbs to mask their slimy texture. Some monasteries even built special snail gardens to ensure a steady supply of these shelled creatures. One French record from 1390 mentions a nobleman purchasing 400 great snails for a feast, suggesting they weren't just famine food, but sometimes considered a delicacy. The practice of eating snails became so ingrained in French culture that it survived long after medieval times, evolving into the modern escargot we know today. Slugs, on the other hand, were truly desperate measures. With no protective shell and an overwhelmingly slimy body, they were usually only eaten in the worst famines. Records from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 mention people gathering slugs after rainstorms when they were most visible. Some brave souls ate them raw, while others tried boiling them with whatever herbs they could find to make them somewhat palatable. If medieval peasants had restaurant reviews, slug dishes would definitely get 1 star. Texture like boogers, tastes like dirt, would not recommend. The beauty of these crawling creatures, if you can call it that, was how easily available they were to both rich and poor. Anyone could catch them, requiring no special equipment or skills. During severe food shortages, entire villages would go frog hunting at dusk when frogs were most active. These hunting expeditions were medieval Europe's version of fast food, except the food was literally trying to hop or slime away from you. While nettles and tree bark filled medieval bellies, as we saw earlier, these crawling creatures at least provided some protein. But if catching slimy creatures sounds unappetizing, just wait until you discover what else was crawling onto medieval dinner plates. Did you know a single locust swarm in medieval Europe could contain up to 10 billion insects and destroy every crop in its path within hours? When these devastating swarms descended upon villages, peasants had two choices: starve or eat the enemy. They chose the latter. Locusts became an unexpected food source during these infestations. The Bible mentions locusts as clean food in Leviticus, which gave medieval Christians permission to roast these crunchy critters without religious guilt. Desert locusts contain about 62% protein, making them more nutritious than beef. Medieval people would catch them by the basketful, roast them over fire until crispy, and sometimes grind them into powder. This insect flour got mixed with regular flour to create a protein-rich bread that helped many survive when all other food sources were gone. The original protein powder wasn't sold in fancy containers at the gym, it was crawling through your garden. Beetles joined the medieval menu too, particularly in Northern Europe. Unlike locusts that came in devastating swarms, beetles required active hunting. Children would be sent to collect them from trees and rotting logs, the medieval version of grocery shopping. Some beetles were eaten raw, while others were boiled first. The larger stag beetles were particularly prized for their meat content. One account from a monastery in Germany describes how during a harsh winter, the monks survived for weeks on a stew made primarily from ground beetles mixed with whatever herbs they could find under the snow. Medieval parents didn't have to trick their kids into eating protein. They just didn't tell them exactly what kind of meat was for dinner. Now for the truly desperate times, lice consumption. Historical records from several severe famines mention people reduced to eating the lice from their own bodies and clothing. One chronicle from the famine of 1315 describes a man who took the vermin from his garments and consumed them, having no other sustenance. This practice wasn't common and only happened during the most extreme circumstances, but it shows the unimaginable lengths people went to for survival. When your food is feeding on you, the food chain becomes more of a disturbing circle. While frogs and snails provided some protein, as we saw earlier, bugs offered a more abundant, if less appetizing, source of nutrition. When even insects weren't enough to satisfy hunger, medieval people turned their eyes towards something else that scurried about their homes and villages. During lengthy medieval sieges, rats were actually sold at markets for food. That's right, the very pests spreading disease through medieval towns became valuable commodities when hunger struck. Historical accounts mention desperate people paying a full day's wages for a single fat rat. Rats were typically skinned, gutted, and then either boiled in a pot or roasted on a stick. Medieval cooks learned to soak rat meat in vinegar or wine to soften it before cooking. Rat was never featured in royal feasts, but it did have the distinction of being the only meat that came pre-stuffed with yesterday's garbage. Mice were treated similarly to rats, though they provided less meat. Their smaller size made them easier to trap in large numbers, and they were often skewered several at a time. You know, times are tough when your pet cat becomes both unemployed and lunch meat. Speaking of cats, these beloved pets sometimes met unfortunate ends during extreme famines or long winters. Records from the Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 CE mention that after rats and mice became scarce, cats and small dogs were next on the menu. The chronicler Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés wrote that, "Blessed was he who could snare a cat." Some medieval cookbooks even included instructions for preparing rats, recommending to singe the hair completely before cooking. Medieval recipe books clearly operated on a different standard than modern cooking shows. While bugs could provide some nutrition, as we saw earlier, rodents offered more substantial meat when all other options disappeared. But even when proper meat wasn't available, medieval people got creative with their bread recipes. If your bread crunches like gravel, it probably is gravel. When flour ran out during medieval famines, people got creative and desperate with their bread making. Sawdust became a common ingredient mixed into whatever tiny amount of flour families might have. Wood chips from sawmills were collected, ground into a fine powder, and added to stretch what little wheat flour remained. The phrase, earning your daily bread, took on a whole new meaning when your teeth might literally break while eating it. Clay was another shocking addition to medieval famine bread. In parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, a special type of clay with high mineral content was dried, ground, and mixed with whatever flour was available. Medieval bread ingredients would never pass today's food safety inspections. may contain traces of literal earth. Perhaps most disturbing was the addition of crushed bones to medieval bread. Animal bones left over from rare meat meals were saved, dried by the fire, ground into powder, and mixed into dough. Some desperate communities during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 even used human bones from recent burials. When not resorting to these extreme measures, medieval peasants used more palatable alternatives to wheat. Acorns were collected, soaked to remove bitter tannins, dried, and ground into flour. Chestnut flour became common in mountain regions. The most common wheat replacement, however, was simple hay. Dried grasses chopped fine, soaked in water, and pressed into shapes resembling bread loaves. Medieval bakers didn't need fancy recipe books. They just looked at whatever wasn't nailed down and thought, I bet I could bake that. With stomachs filled with dubious bread substitutes, medieval people needed something to wash it all down. No clean water, no problem. Medieval people drank beer at breakfast. Most water sources were contaminated with human waste and animal runoff, making them deadly to drink. Beer, thanks to the boiling process and alcohol content, killed most of the dangerous bacteria. Medieval mothers didn't tell their kids to drink 8 glasses of water a day. They handed them a mug of morning ale and told them to stop complaining about homework. Small beer, a weekly alcoholic brew with just 2 to 3% alcohol content, served as the main hydration source for everyone, including children. This wasn't scandalous. The low alcohol content was safer than water, but not enough to get anyone drunk. Small beer was often made from the second or third brewing of grain mash after the stronger stuff had been made for the adults. The poorest people drank some truly desperate concoctions. Fermented cabbage juice became popular in Eastern Europe. Spoiled wine mixed with herbs and honey created a drink called posset that was believed to have medicinal properties. The medieval equivalent of 5-second rule was more like 5-month rule when it came to beverages. One of the most unusual medieval drinks was blood mixed with herbs, ale, or vinegar. In regions where animal slaughter was rare, nothing went to waste, including blood. Fresh animal blood was mixed with spices and consumed immediately or fermented briefly with ale. Mead made from overripe fruit or honey scraped from old combs was another common beverage. Medieval bartenders didn't need fancy mixology classes. Their specialty drink menu featured slightly less likely to kill you than the water. While their bread was often filled with questionable ingredients, as we saw earlier, their drinks were equally creative solutions to survival. But medieval food preservation took things to another level. Fish buried in the ground to rot before eating might sound like a cruel prank, but for medieval Scandinavians, it was dinner. Fermentation, letting food partially decompose in a controlled way, was the Middle Ages version of refrigeration. In Iceland, hakarl was made by burying shark meat in the ground for 6 weeks, then hanging it to dry for several more months. The dish was so potent that first-time eaters were advised to hold their nose while chewing, making it the original hold my beer food challenge. Vikings weren't conquerors because they were brave in battle. They were just running away from whoever was cooking dinner that night. Eggs preserved in a mixture of clay, ash, salt, quicklime, and rice husks became century eggs in medieval China. The preservation process turned the whites dark brown or black and the yolks green or gray with a strong sulfur smell. Century eggs weren't actually centuries old, but they smelled like they might have witnessed the fall of Rome. If time travel ever becomes possible, medieval food preservation would be terrible at keeping its age a secret. Milk, which spoils quickly without refrigeration, was often deliberately soured as a preservation method. Clabbered milk, milk allowed to naturally curdle at room temperature, became a staple food across medieval Europe. Medieval Europeans didn't cry over spilled milk. They celebrated when milk spoiled just the right amount. Is this milk bad? Wasn't a question. It was a serving suggestion. In Eastern Europe, cabbage fermented in its own juices created sauerkraut, a vitamin-rich food that helps prevent scurvy during winter. No fridges, no health inspectors, just strong stomachs and the knowledge that being hungry tomorrow was scarier than disgusting today. While medieval drinks often bordered on the dangerous side, as we saw earlier, at least their fermented foods had preserved nutrients. But when food ran so low that even fermentation wasn't an option, medieval cooks got even more creative. Some medieval stews simmered for weeks, with new ingredients added daily. These perpetual pots hung permanently over hearth fires. never fully emptied before being refilled. The original slow cooker wasn't a kitchen appliance, it was Grandma refusing to wash the pot between February and June. Bones were reboiled multiple times until they stopped giving flavor, then ground into powder for bread. Nothing was wasted when food was scarce. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, served as medieval plates. After soaking up meat juices during the meal, these edible dishes were eaten as the final course. Medieval dishwashers were much more efficient than modern ones. You could literally eat the dishes when you were done with them. Tavern stews contained whatever was available, no questions asked. The original mystery meat wasn't served in school cafeterias. It was ladled out in roadside inns where the recipe changed based on whatever animal happened to wander too close to the kitchen. While fermentation preserved food through controlled spoilage, as we saw earlier, recycling meals made each precious bit stretch further. But when it came to feasting, even the wealthy created bizarre culinary experiments that would make modern dinner guests question their friendship with the host. Peacocks served with their feathers reattached after cooking were the showstoppers of medieval noble feasts. While peasants scraped by on tree bark and rodents, the wealthy competed to create the most outlandish dishes possible. Royal banquets featured specially prepared peacocks that were carefully skinned before cooking. After roasting, the bird would be sewn back into its magnificent feather coat, creating the illusion of a live bird on the table. Sometimes the peacock's beak was covered in gold leaf, and small pieces of cotton soaked in alcohol were placed in its mouth and lit on fire, making the cooked bird appear to breathe flames. Medieval dinner parties weren't just about food. They were theatrical productions where everything was edible except the plates, though, as we've seen, sometimes even those were eaten. Hedgehogs were another peculiar delicacy served to medieval nobles. These spiny creatures were prepared by cutting open the belly, removing the innards, stuffing the cavity with pork, sage, eggs, and spices, then roasting the animal and serving it with a sauce made from the hedgehog's own blood mixed with wine. A 14th century French cookbook called Le Viandier includes detailed instructions for hedgehog preparation, suggesting it wasn't just a one-off curiosity, but a recognized dish in fancy medieval cooking. Porpoises and dolphins were classified as royal fish in medieval England, meaning they were technically reserved for the monarch's table. These sea mammals were often baked in pies or roasted and served with a pepper sauce. Despite their current protected status, medieval nobility considered them prestigious food, especially during fasting periods when land animals were forbidden, but fish, which included dolphins in medieval classification, were allowed. The medieval food pyramid had some seriously questionable classifications. Apparently, if it swam, it counted as a fish, even if it had lungs and nursed its young. Perhaps the most visually impressive of all medieval fancy foods were the elaborate jelly creations. Cooks would boil pig's feet and fish bladders to create a natural gelatin, which was then colored with vegetable dyes and molded into spectacular shapes, castles, ships, or heraldic animals. These wobbly masterpieces were flavored with wine, honey, and spices, creating show-stopping centerpieces that were both decorative and edible. One particularly elaborate royal feast in 1466 featured 25 jelly castles, each topped with a different colorful banner. Medieval Instagram would have been nothing but jelly castle photos with the caption, "Eating good tonight." Blessed Schauch Royal Feast. The wealthy also enjoyed meat dyed in unexpected colors, blue chicken, gold-colored eggs, or red fish, all achieved using natural colorings like indigo, saffron, or beetroot. These bizarre color alterations weren't just for show, they were believed to enhance the magical properties of the food, as medieval medicine associated certain colors with health benefits. While the poor recycled every scrap of food as we saw earlier, the rich turned their abundance into edible art projects. But when even the wealthy faced religious fasting requirements or meat shortages, they had to get creative with substitutions that mimicked the real thing. Grain milk from oats, almonds, or mashed peas became a medieval necessity when animal milk was unavailable. The Catholic Church imposed over 150 fasting days per year when animal products were forbidden, making plant-based alternatives essential even for those who weren't starving. Almond milk was the most popular dairy substitute, made by grinding almonds into a paste, mixing with water, and straining the liquid. Cookbooks from wealthy households contained dozens of recipes using almond milk, from sweet puddings to savory sauces. Medieval monks weren't ahead of their time with plant-based milk. They just didn't want to get smited for drinking the real stuff on fasting days. Cheese substitutes emerged from similar religious restrictions and practical necessity. When dairy was forbidden or unavailable, medieval cooks created convincing imitations using ground nuts, beans, and breadcrumbs. Almond cheese was made by curdling almond milk with vinegar, then pressing and aging the solids. Pea flour mixed with herbs and salt was formed into cheese-like wheels and aged briefly. These plant-based cheeses were often colored with saffron or other spices to mimic the appearance of the real thing. A recipe from a 15th century monastery describes a fasting cheese made from ground chestnuts that was nearly indistinguishable from true cheese in both appearance and texture, though the taste fools no one. Fake meat became an art form during medieval times, with cooks developing elaborate techniques to create meatless versions of popular dishes. Mushrooms, particularly large puffballs, were sliced and prepared to mimic steaks. Ground nuts mixed with breadcrumbs, herbs, and egg whites created convincing meatballs or patties. Some medieval cookbooks contain recipes for mock fish, made from turnips carved into fish shapes, poached, and served with herb sauce. Medieval vegans didn't give up meat because of ethical concerns. They gave it up because the church said no meat Fridays and Wednesdays and during Advent and Lent, and perhaps the most ingenious meat substitute was fake venison, made from mashed beans, breadcrumbs, and strong herbs formed around sticks to create ribs that were roasted and basted with wine and fat. The appearance was convincing enough that some monasteries banned these imitations during strict fasting periods because they looked too much like the real thing. Medieval food inspectors would have had a field day. "Sir, I'm going to need you to prove that's actually a turnip and not a trout." The widespread use of fake foods wasn't just about religious rules. It reflected the harsh realities of medieval life, where real meat, milk, and cheese were expensive luxuries even in good times. These ingenious substitutions helped people survive both the restrictions of church calendars and the more pressing restrictions of empty pantries. From tree bark bread to fake meats, medieval people demonstrated remarkable creativity in the face of hunger. Their desperate food solutions remind us that human ingenuity shines brightest when the stomach growls loudest.